And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for the last panel discussion of the defense track of the Warsaw Security Forum 2022. The closing discussion will focus on a hugely important topic, which should be, and I'm sure it is, a concern for all of us. The title of the panel is Nuclear Deterrence and Arms Control in an Era of Strategic Competition. And what could be more important than answering that today? The panel discussion will be moderated by Łukasz Kulesa, Deputy Head of Research at PISM. Before I call Łukasz to the stage, I would like to remind those of you in the audience that, of course, if you'd like to ask a question, you can approach the microphone to the side of the stage. And to anyone following the conversational line, you can join the discussion by using the hashtag WSF2022. And now, with that being said, let's give Łukasz a very welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much, Derika. And I was thinking about the entrance music for our session. One of the candidates in my mind was the song Danger Zone from Top Gun. The one from The Police, which includes the line, I hope the Russians love their children too, which was about the Cold War threat of nuclear weapons and nuclear annihilation. Unfortunately, it seems we are back to that position. On behalf of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, we are very happy to be one of the program partners of the Warsaw Security Forum. As you may see, there is one change in the setting of this panel as compared to the agenda you have in your program. Unfortunately, Casey Deering could not join us, and we wish her all a speedy and full recovery. My colleague from the Institute, Artur Kacprzyk, has kindly agreed to join the session in an emergency mode. The session is about the relationship, I hope it will be about the relationship between nuclear deterrence and arms control in the contemporary era that we may agree or disagree, but was described by the organizer as the era of strategic competition. I would maybe put it in plural, the era of strategic competitions, because it seems there are a couple of them going on in parallel. But some in the audience may ask, why are we including arms control? Should we maybe talk just about nuclear deterrence? Because it seems to be in the news very much, and this is something heavy on our thinking. We already had it yesterday and earlier today at this conference. So I would respond to that by quoting late Michael Krepon, the great expert on arms control issue. In one of his latest posts, he wrote that nuclear deterrence is dangerous by design, and it can fail. But because nuclear deterrence is dangerous by design, it requires various forms of reassurance to help prevent nuclear use. We call this means of reassurance arms control. I very much agree with his statement. I would like to also test it with our esteemed panelists, that deterrence and arms control can go together and actually must coexist to enable us to prevent catastrophic outcomes. Let me now just very briefly introduce the panelists, starting from my far right. Sibylle Bauer, she's the Director of Studies, Armament and Disarmament at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. Also the chair of the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium, which if you don't know about, you should check it out rather urgently. PISM is one of the proud members of the consortium. Next, Ambassador Rolf Nikel, Vice President of DGAP, but also formerly the German Federal Commissioner for Disarmament and Arms Control, and also former ambassador to Poland, very warmly remember. Next, General Chris Badia, Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Transformation NATO, coming to us from Norfolk, Virginia. But of course with a long and distinguished career with the German Armed Forces NATO position and also the German Ministry of Defense. Artur Kasprzyk, analyst in the International Security Program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, focusing very much on issues of deterrence and arms control. And we probably cannot go any other way but to start our panel with the question about your assessment of the level of the nuclear threat following Mr. Putin's "this is not a bluff" statement and the flurry of commentaries, analyses it caused. So the assessment of the level of threat and also how likely and what could be the potential response to the potential use of nuclear weapons. Rolf, can we perhaps start with you?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Great to be back in Warsaw after 6 fantastic years already a while ago. To your question, I think it's important not to consider the statement of Mr. Putin a total bluff. If he is cornered in Ukraine, nothing can be completely excluded, including the use of nuclear weapon. However, the probability of use of nuclear weapon at this stage seems to be relatively remote or limited. First of all, the military usefulness of nuclear weapons is very questionable. Nuclear weapons are high-class weapons, and there is still an international taboo on them. It would be a further loss of domestic credibility. Putin describes the war still as a special operation, and even after the annexation. The Russian military doctrine legitimizes the use of nuclear weapon in very limited cases. So I think it would be quite a further loss of domestic credibility should he decide to use them. Third point, there would be, no question, a strong reaction from the West. President Biden has been very clear on that, with the 3 times, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And fourthly, I think Russia, in using nuclear weapons, would violate this international taboo, would become even more of an international pariah. And this is important because when you look at the United Nations, there are still a number of countries who are sitting on the fence, who have not decided yet completely in which way they will go. So it makes a difference whether India, Indonesia, Brazil or others condemn Russian behavior or not. So I think this is clearly why I think it's not very likely at this stage that he will use nuclear weapons. If he chooses to do so, our reaction should be very strong on the political track, on the sanctions track, and on the military track. Obviously, there would be a very emotional situation, but we have to be calm and carry on like the Brits used to say. Under these circumstances, we need to maintain Western unity, stay the course, continue to deliver weapons, including heavy weapons, and I say this here specifically in Warsaw, avoid criticism amongst allies, which only jeopardizes cohesion and plays into the hands of Mr. Putin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. General Badia, of course, I understand the constraints under which you are as NATO official, as an officer in this unrestricted setting. So I won't push you on the details of the potential response or options, but I would be very much interested in your assessment of the level of threat and the Russian behavior.
Yeah, Łukasz, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I fully agree to what the ambassador just said. What I would like to add from a military perspective and point of view, and in the work we do, never underestimate. What do I mean by that? Of course, what President Putin has said, we take absolutely serious, okay? And you have to. Especially if you see what happens on the Ukraine war, how Russia is doing overall, and what might be some reaction to that from his perspective or Russian perspective. Having said all that, without going into further detail, NATO is a defensive alliance. We are prepared with all means that are available. And of course, you can imagine that with having said that all options are on the table. From a military point of view, there will be military advice. It's continuously military advice to our political masters in leadership. And as just said, if it should happen like that, it will come to a reaction which is politically decided then. But let me assure you, NATO would be ready.
Thank you very much. Sibylle, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Łukasz. There are many ways to respond to that question. And the first answer is actually that we have been notoriously bad at predicting the future. We keep being surprised, the pandemic just being one example. And one of the key questions is if we can be counting on rational behavior. I agree with Rolf that there's no military case for nuclear weapons use. There's always scope for irrational behavior. There's always scope for inadvertent escalation. There's always scope for accidents, especially when somebody is playing with the fire, like now. And what we are seeing here seems to be a particularly unpleasant form of Russian roulette. We can also say that we have been fortunately lucky for many decades. Nuclear risk has been around. It has never gone away. It has taken different shapes and forms. What's a bit new is that we are talking very much about deliberate use. That's a possibility. So previously there was a lot of talk about inadvertent escalation, incident and accident risk, especially in relation to emerging technologies. And if you look back at lessons in history, maybe you have to go all the way back to the post-Cuban Missile Crisis and finding ways of crisis communication and going forward. But so far also there has been no clear evidence of deployment of tactical weapons on the Russian side. It seems that the warheads are still separate from the delivery vehicles. And while President Putin's statement is a way to reiterate existing Russian doctrine, there is, as we all know, some ambiguity in that term, territorial integrity, especially with the latest annexations. And one remark that I wanted to emphasize here also, I really dislike the term tactical nuclear weapons. Non-strategic maybe is a bit better, because it really does not convey the gravity of what nuclear weapons use in that case would entail for the nuclear taboo and for humanitarian consequences. But I do want to end on a positive note, because I'm a stubborn optimist. I really hope that the P5 statement from January of this year, that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought, will hold. So that's my hope.
Thank you very much, especially for reminding us that the nuclear deterrence may look solid in retrospect, but in practice it consisted on some pretty dangerous episodes, and the issue of inadvertent escalation, accidents and incidents is not something in the past. Artur, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So not an easy task to add something after three distinguished panelists, and I agree with many things that were already said. I would just start by, there are different scenarios. I think that the scenario of out-of-the-blue nuclear attack against a NATO country from Russia right now is totally unrealistic. This would go against the Russian goal, which was from the very beginning of the war to deter NATO from joining this conflict. That's why they started threatening with nuclear weapons in February. Now President Putin is threatening with nuclear weapons to Ukraine, and I think that this scenario of nuclear attack against Ukraine is a plausible one, but I would agree that the risk is remote due to the reasons that were mentioned already today. The threat is ambiguous. I would expect Russia to come up with much more direct threats towards Ukraine if Russia was actually close to nuclear use. I mean, there could be an ultimatum, right? Stop this or you will face consequences that you have never seen, something like this. Secondly, I think that President Putin is very keen to threaten with nuclear weapons. So far, I think he wasn't keen to use them. He actually, if you look at the decision to mobilize additional reservists and conscripts in Russia, well, he preferred to do that and take that risk instead of using a nuclear weapon. And it is a risky decision, this mobilization, as we see, because it's very controversial. It creates tensions within Russia, right? Social tensions. That said, we can't exclude that if Putin is desperate, if he's facing some kind of major defeat, that he will resort to nuclear use. We are not sure of his red lines in Ukraine. The task for the world basically is, to put it bluntly, I think, to convince Putin that the cost of using a nuclear weapon would be higher than the cost of losing the war with Ukraine. And not just convincing Putin, but Russian elites and Russia at large. Now, I can get back in more detail to what the response could be. I would just say that it is absolutely correct to have the ambiguity in deterrence from the Western side towards Russia regarding its nuclear use. I think that the response would be it would be on a case-by-case basis. It would depend from the specific of the attack. I mean, I believe that keeping the option of NATO conventional intervention against Russian forces in and around Ukraine is key to try to deter such an attack. That said, I can imagine situations in which increasing weapons deliveries to Ukraine and isolating Russia economically, not just by the West, but by the whole world, could be a sufficient punishment if, for example, the attack is very limited or just some symbolic explosion over the Black Sea. But in case of much more destructive attacks, NATO's conventional response is the way to go, I would say.
Thank you very much. Our panelists seem to be broadly in the same camp of not dismissing the Russian statements as a bluff, but also I think a quote that Rolf mentioned, keep calm and carry on, especially with regards to our assistance towards Ukraine. If you have any questions at this point, you would need to wait. Please keep them in your heads because I'm sure we'll return very much to these issues in our Q&A part of the discussion. But before we get there, I would like us to zoom out a little bit from the Russian threat, as imminent as it is, to the more general questions of how do we see the place of deterrence and arms control in this new era. And obviously, Russia is not the only nuclear player around. We have the shadow of China, which is, according to the information which we have, getting bigger actually in the nuclear domain, but every nuclear silo that they build. We just had the news about another North Korean missile tests. Obviously, their nuclear arsenal has moved from the realm of possibility to very much to the realm of reality. We also have India and Pakistan and their uneasy trilateral relationship with China. And of course, we have our 3 nuclear weapon states in NATO. This is just about the nuclear weapon states that we know about. There is also the Israeli issue. There are also potentially other countries looking at this capability and thinking about proliferation. So I would just want to stress that this is much more complicated and much more complex picture that we would like to unravel a little bit. And this time I would like to start with General Badia. Allied Command Transformation task, or one of the tasks, is to think strategically about the future and what kind of capabilities are required for NATO, what kind of approaches are required to tackle with the challenges or tomorrow. And for a while, many thought that actually nuclear weapons are the challenges of yesterday, that this is a kind of weapon on its way out, or actually somewhere in the background, just for very extreme scenarios of the questions of survival of the state. Now it seems that nuclear weapons are back and with the vengeance. So if you could maybe walk us through your thinking about the role of nuclear deterrence and also the relationship between nuclear deterrence and arms control and how it may evolve in the future. General, over to you.
Thank you very much. You've just said it. One of our main tasks is warfare development, which means looking out into the future and predicting with strategic foresight analysis what will be the challenge 2030, 2040, how does future war look, how the conflicts might look like. And with all that, you can imagine, and it's not only nuclear we are, of course, having in the focus. It's much more than that. It's new technologies, emerging disrupting technologies. What does cyber give us? What does space hold us? And especially if you look through all the domains, that comes back to deterrence, because if you want to deter, and nothing is black and white today in the answer, you have to look at all aspects. And this is what we do. And besides that, the other main task is we develop, together with the nations, the capabilities needed for the future, be common funded or national funded. Having said that, one of the major tasks NATO is, of course, following is how do we produce more security and generate a field of security. To your question, how does it basically interact, or what's the relationship towards then arms control? I can tell you that, of course, in order, if you want to produce security, arms control is one of the major pillars. You always have to think it, and this is what we do in all the work we do, and we see arms control as one of the vehicles to ensure security overall. Having said that, I just would like to remind you that if you look at the new strategic concept that was just agreed in Madrid, if you look at page 1, para 7, there it says, as long as there are nuclear weapons in the world, this alliance will be a nuclear alliance. And this is very, very important. And further on, if you look into the deterrence and defense chapter, there are 5 to 6 paras where nuclear deterrence is described very well on what we are doing in the future and how we see that. And again, this was, of course, closely connected to arms control in order to see how you manage that and how you get there. Because at the end of the day, everything is about escalation dynamics and escalation management, and you have to understand all the mechanics behind it. If I say that, well, when it comes to deterrence, this is what NATO holds, and this is what we do from Norfolk House when we look at the full suite of capabilities NATO is holding within all the major domains. And this goes from, of course, from conventional to nuclear capabilities. But this is how you have to play it. The aim is, and this is not only something NATO looks at, this is everybody looks at, because what you want to do is you want to create a volume of uncertainty to your opponent. He never can be assured what the reaction will be. In order to do that, you have to have all means available and all options available, be it at the end of the day, be it conventional or be it nuclear. And let me say that as well. And this is, if you look into the strategic concept, and also it plays into the nuclear deterrence, everything is about allies, partners. And when it comes to partners, it's organizations. Why do I say that? Because we sit here, it's, for instance, European Union. It's not only military instruments of power, it's instruments of power. And if you look what the European Union, for instance, has available, this all plays into deterrence at the end of the day. And I come back to what I said, arms control is, of course, one of them. Let me make one final remark, because the question is, should the nuclear role within the concept of NATO, should it come, should it have more focus, or should it be in a stronger view? Let me put it this way. The way I see it, and from our command's perspective, is the capabilities of NATO are well balanced. And this is what it's essential at the end of the day. From conventional through nuclear, everything is there, and everything is pretty well developed. The other thing is, if you see how the alliance developed over the past 7 years consecutively, we have an increase in the defense spending. 21, it was a 3.1% increase again. We have over 1 trillion now common defense spending amongst our 30 nations right now. 21 of our nations already spending more than 20% of their budget for new capabilities and new equipment. There you see, it really comes down to how you modernize, how you go forward. Having said that, when it comes to the deterrence overall, and this is not only about capabilities at the end of the day, it's about training, it's about the simulation, it's about exercises, and this we all do in order to be prepared for the future. And with that, I think we are well off. But let me finish with the statement, of course, arms control and arms control talks are one of the major pillars within our thoughts.
Thank you very much. I just may say that we've heard this well balanced for quite a while. I don't really remember Alliance saying that their capabilities are not well balanced. So under the well balanced phrase, you actually can have a lot of changes. Because that's also connected with the change of the nature of the threat. For at least for me, it's natural for the alliance to say that the capabilities are correct, but it would make your work a little bit redundant, right?
That's a good, you putting the finger in one discussion point, because we're discussing, is the future, is it threat-based or is it capability-based? And I tell you, all the work we do, it's capability-based, threat-informed. Because if you're just threat-based, you will always be fighting the war from yesterday.
Thank you very much. Now, Sibylle, you come from the institute that has a long and noble tradition of working towards disarmament, risk reduction, and rather disarmament than armament. Let me put it like this, even if you watch the armament market very closely. So from your viewpoint, what's the role and the rationale for the arms control, risk reduction, non-proliferation agenda in this era of various strategic competitions? What place do they have, if they have place at all? Because I can immediately have a number of articles coming in the Google search which say the death of arms control, the death of non-proliferation. So how would you maybe react also to these?
It's a very important question, but also a very difficult question. So obviously, I believe that arms control, non-proliferation, disarmament are very important and continue to be key pillars. The question is how in the current context. And it's very easy to paint a gloomy picture. So as you say, what the Google search will reveal is the arms control architecture is crumbling. When you speak to diplomats who have negotiated arms control treaties, they are quite depressed because they feel like their life work is fading away. Disarmament prospects are often referred to as gloomy as well. At the same time, all nuclear weapons possessing states are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, so the tendency is more towards armament, not disarmament in the nuclear field. We talked about the risk of nuclear weapons use just now, and the strategic disagreements between the US and Russia clearly predate the invasion, and I would say also even 2014. But it's too easy, I think, to be pessimistic. And I've already said that I think I like to be a stubborn optimist, looking for opportunities. So I'd like to highlight some areas where I think things can be done. And I very much believe that if everyone is looking in the same direction, we will miss something that may be flying towards us from a different direction. And that can be very dangerous. And one of those may well be a proliferation crisis. We are lucky to still be at 9. And with all the talk now about the value of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, there may well be others who are getting more interested in having their own capability, not just in joining the nuclear umbrella. So what can we do? One priority is to save what can be saved. The norm against nuclear testing, CTBT, still not in force. Also, there still needs to be a fissile material cutoff treaty to be negotiated, and the obstacles to some of those treaties are not to be found in Moscow. They are found to be in different capitals around the world. Also, focus on the future. There's a lot that can be done in investing in the next generation, in youth initiatives, in education. Focus also on nuclear risk reduction, on crisis communication, on crisis stability. And I think there's always scope for engagement. Russia is not a monolithic actor. There's track 1.5, track 2. There are other nuclear weapon possessing states. There's not just China, there are others. There should be military-to-military contacts wherever possible with all of those countries. And I think it's really important to try to be creative in carving out spaces where engagement is possible. And that can be sometimes in a very technical area. In the past, that was possible in the P5 context. In the global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism, one may be able to find certain spaces where we can still keep engagement going. It's also really important to invest in regional security, because nuclear weapons are never just in isolation. That's something that we see very clearly in the European security context now. And it's also an opportunity to rethink and to challenge old ways of thinking. And I think it's a practical challenge and it's an intellectual challenge for all of us. And I think we need the best of the best to put our minds to this issue and this challenge. And I also think we got a bit complacent in the policy world and in the intellectual world in between these two Cold Wars, thinking it was all a bit sorted. And one of the areas of constructive new thinking is actually this feminist foreign policy that was referred to yesterday, and taking it a bit broader to have more inclusive, more diverse decision-making in finding new solutions and bringing in new stakeholders and new generations. Then I think we all agree that it's a very difficult geopolitical context for actual arms control negotiations, but there's always scope to consult, and there's always scope to prepare. So in preparing for future negotiations, there's a lot of work to be done technically and in thinking through verification challenges, in thinking through how to deal with conventional nuclear entanglements, thinking through how to do cross-domain arms control, that's a very difficult one, and how to deal with all the emerging technologies. Technology governance. So we started talking a lot about artificial intelligence, but we are far from having it sorted and understanding all the implications and the connections to new and old technologies. We have the brain sciences, and we have quantum technologies. And we are very much at the start of really understanding all the different implications for that. There's also scope for unilateral initiatives. There's the president of the Nuclear Security Summits. There's a lot that could be done, presidential statements and so on. We still don't have a global missile treaty. There's a lot of homework to be done in preparing that. And to conclude, what I actually think may be, it's a hypothesis, we'll see if that comes true, a realistic pathway towards disarmament may be nuclear weapons becoming a liability in terms of quantities and payloads because of either their cost or because of technological vulnerabilities in connection to cyber attacks, in connection to terrorism, in connection to the different strands of emerging technologies. And just to remind us of what we haven't anticipated in the future, attacks on nuclear power plants by state actors is not something that we had foreseen. So I'm sure that also in relation to nuclear weapons and their safety, there are many things that we had not foreseen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure we come back to many of the doors that you opened in the subsequent discussion. Now I would like to go to Artur. And Poland is a non-nuclear weapon state, the last time I checked at least. But it is very much covered by the nuclear extended deterrence guarantees through NATO. And their credibility, their effectiveness is debated quite hotly in this country, and you contributed also to this debate to your research and analysis. Today we had the statement from the president saying that the issue of Polish participation in nuclear sharing is an open issue picked up with the Americans. So could you perhaps give us your assessment, not the Polish assessment, but a voice from Warsaw on the state of NATO's nuclear deterrence, the credibility part, but also perhaps the attitude towards arms control and risk reduction that were discussed before?
Okay, thank you. So to begin with, to state the obvious, NATO's nuclear deterrence holds. It's working, at least it's not failing in this crisis. That being said, crisis is far from over, unfortunately, related to Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course. And we can't be sure at this moment what lessons we will draw from this crisis about Russia's approach to nuclear weapons and what lessons Russia will draw about NATO's deterrence. To me, already at this stage, of course, it is concerning that Russia has showed itself to be prone to miscalculation. The very invasion itself, it was a big risk and a big mistake. It is very likely that because Russia will be for long weakened in terms of conventional forces, its reliance on nuclear weapons after this war will increase. That's at least for the short and medium term. So there are uncertainties about the future. Regarding NATO adaptation, well, NATO's nuclear deterrent was very much neglected for most of the post-Cold War period. After 2014, NATO made progress in adapting its nuclear deterrence, but I think we're not there yet. We're not, where we should be. And I have a bigger problem with, so to speak, software, nor hardware. So I'll speak shortly about capabilities later, but I think in NATO, much more in Europe than in North America, I think there is still insufficient understanding of nuclear weapons-related issues. The approach of many decision makers is very much emotional, and quite often you could see that decision makers in Europe either avoid the subject of nuclear weapons, or if they speak about it, many of the statements related to it betray, I would say, a large dose of oversensitivity related to nuclear weapons. To give you an example, during this crisis, I think many statements were made which overemphasized the risk of escalation from Russia against NATO if certain kinds of equipment are delivered to Ukraine. In US, this position got better in time, and we don't hear so much about escalation risk. The volume and the range of equipment being delivered to Ukraine is very much growing. In Europe also, but we still have, for example, debates whether, in some countries like Germany, debates whether delivering tanks to Ukraine is escalatory or not, whether some countries such as Poland have delivered quite a lot of tanks. So these kinds of attitudes and statements, in my opinion, they might send the wrong signal to Russia, and they can impede decision-making, also nuclear decision-making in a crisis, and there needs to be more done on this front. As regards capabilities, it could be very well that the ongoing modernization program of NATO nuclear forces, especially US nuclear forces, is enough to ensure deterrence in the future, but with extended deterrence, it's a very tricky thing. You never really know totally what deters. And definitely from the perspective of a flank state or frontline state, whatever you will, like Poland, definitely you want to have more guarantees, and you want to have complicate the adversary's decision making as much as possible. So in addition to what is already happening in terms of modernization, just two short examples. One, the countries which host US nuclear weapons in Europe are buying F-35 fighters, which is a good way, because it's a stealthy fighter, so it will make the NATO capability more credible. That said, it's not totally invulnerable to air defenses, and over time there is a risk that air defenses will be increasing. Their effectiveness will be increasing. So at this moment, for example, one thing to do is to start thinking, how do you keep that dual-capable aircraft effective in 5, 10, 15 years? Do you buy a nuclear cruise missile for it instead of nuclear gravity bomb? I think so. And the second thing is NATO nuclear sharing. Expanding the number of countries taking part in nuclear sharing would send a political, mostly, signal to Russia, additional political signal of allied resolve. And from political point of view, definitely, the nuclear sharing program was created to underscore the unity of alliance also in nuclear matters. So I don't see any reason why the discussion about Eastern flank or Eastern front countries joining this program should be closed. It should be open. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I get to Rolf, just a technical announcement. We want, since we started late, the organizers have kindly agreed to extend the session. So don't worry, we won't finish at 1 o'clock. You will have time to ask questions and engage into the discussion. Rolf, I would like to draw on your experience also at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where you worked as hard as you could on the cause of restraint, disarmament, and arms control. So the basic question is, where does this agenda go from now? Especially when it comes to the relationship with Russia. Is there, Sibylle said that there is a space for engagement still and contacts, but under which terms, and maybe with preconditions, without preconditions? What's the agenda, or what could be the agenda with Russia, perhaps also with others?
Thank you very much. Let me, before I address your question, say that there is a fundamental conceptual difference between deterring nuclear weapons in Ukraine in a wartime logic and deterring conventional and nuclear attack on NATO territory. It's different because we would need different approaches. In Ukraine, the approach should be not to be deterred and deliver all the kinds of weapons that are necessary, including heavy weapons. When it comes to NATO territory, we have to admit that deterrence has become more important than ever. It is clear that we have to strengthen this deterrence, and this deterrence goes through, first of all, strengthening the eastern flank. NATO has taken the decisions already early on. It has now increased these steps, and I think it's the right thing to do. We have to reinforce the capabilities, and we have to invest and commit more into defense. How does arms control fit in all this now? Arms control is not a goal or an objective in itself. It's a means or an instrument or a tool and part of a larger concept which used to be cooperative security. Now the new concept, the strategic concept of NATO is really clearly submitted to deterrence and defense. And that's where it should belong, because arms control and disarmament are only effective and efficient if they are buttressed by strong military capabilities. If we don't have it, let's forget about it. So this is very, very important. Arms control is part of security policy, but based and buttressed by a strong deterrence and a strong defense by capabilities. I absolutely agree with that. We then have to distinguish between what can be done in Europe and what can be done on a global level. I think there is again a difference here, because on the European level, I'm afraid I'm very skeptical. The arms control architecture is eroding, was already eroding before the crisis, but is even eroding now more. Conventional arms control in Europe is in shambles. The INF treaty is gone. There are lots of problems with START. We may see the end of START. So in the sphere of direct involvement of Russia, unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic. However, we need to be involved when it comes to clear communication to Russia, opening the necessary channels. The military channel is there. The political channel is, people say, oh, no political channel. But maybe a political channel is also needed in order to communicate clearly to the political leadership, not only to the military, because we do not know what the relationship between the military and the political sphere in Russia is. So we need to have that political channel as well. I think the Americans have it. Maybe NATO should also have it, but only in the sense of communicating clearly and transparency, predictability, and reducing risks. So on this, I think it's possible. On the global scale, I share a little bit more the optimism that has been voiced. Because if one thing has become clear in the Ukraine war is that the use of certain ammunitions and certain weapons, of outlawed weapons, is clear. So we need to work on that and need to continue to work on cyber, space, other lethal autonomous weapons, etc. All the agenda we have at the United Nations. So this is important. And I also share the view about the proliferation crisis. If any state that is in the world sees that a state like Ukraine has abandoned its nuclear weapons, I mean, come on, what kind of reaction would that be? So we absolutely need to make sure that we reduce that risk, and that goes by, for example, JCPOA with respect to Iran. It has to be reinstored. We have to address North Korea also in the United Nations, and I think we also need all the other things that you mentioned in your intervention, which I think are highly important. So. Let's use the possibilities we have in the United Nations and in multilateral fora also to include the others. And if Russia does not play by the rules in the international fora, that's again an indication that they don't play by the rules. And that may be important in order to get, I talked about people sitting on the fences, to get those people down from the fences? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me now open the floor to questions and comments. Please introduce yourself, be brief, and specify if you are the question for all the speakers or a specific one. Over there first, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Hiro Akita from Nikkei, from Tokyo. I have a question to General. President Biden said that the US will not intervene to Ukraine because we need to avoid nuclear exchange. But if Russia use nuclear in Ukraine, this premise, do you think that this premise exists, or it will change the premise? And then that leads to my second question. If that is the case, you said that the NATO now have all options on the table, and does it include the conventional intervention to Ukraine? Because if they use nuke, the premise Mr. Biden, said will collapse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First row, Wojtek. The microphone is coming from the other way.
Okay, thank you very much. Wojciech Łukasz, defense analyst, Warsaw, Poland. First, some remarks. I'm sorry. It's something which was lacked in your analysis. It's technical development. This is a lack of technical issues in your debate. You are concentrated, first of all, on political decision making, but contemporary nuclear forces, especially tactical forces, are not the same than like in Hiroshima period. This is everything developed, like guided missiles, like artificial intelligence, everything when go forward. And now you can different ways of testing and developing nuclear weapons without possibility, with avoiding possibility to make explosion. Everything can be simulated by the supercomputers. So the technical development is closing us to using very small tactical nuclear weapons. This is the first, my remark. The second, I don't know if anybody can realize that 2 nuclear explosions had been already detected in Ukraine. One in '72, that was in the coal mine, and the Soviet Union used the nuclear explosion in one of the coal mines near the north of the contemporary Ukraine to deter the gas. The gas danger in one of the mines, and the second the same in the same situation in '79. What is the importance of that? This is that the edge of decision making in let's say Eastern Hemisphere is not the same like decision making edge in the Western Hemisphere, and we are talking about the Eastern Hemisphere. So all those debates with the mentality of the Western world and Western people, they are quite different than the mentality we are facing right now. So we have to consider that, and the edge and the edge of the let's say last decision making in the East is quite different. So put it under consideration. And the question is that to the general, first of all, general, I spoke with Phil Breedlove 2 days ago, and to the other generals, and I consider that mainly in the hand of the NATO and the NATO and the American hands is a first of all conventional answer on any sort of let's say nuclear threat against Ukraine. And could you please specify which are those steps which are considered by the NATO? I know that the Belgorod 22 the closest to the Ukrainian border military nuclear storage is constantly monitored from the air, from the space, and so on. But if they open that Belgorod 22 storage, what the NATO is going to do as a planning body? This is my clear question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The third question over there in the back.
Thank you very much, Alisa Vogt from Körber Stiftung. And I have a question to Mr. Kapritsch. I found your remarks very interesting on how the debate on nuclear weapons is very emotional among decision makers. And that communication on how decision makers are afraid of that being an escalatory or a reason for escalation. And I was wondering if you could specify what instead you would wish for. I mean, I agree that there is not enough conversation on the topic also with the public, but I think it's natural that it's an emotional topic, that people are afraid and that it's something we need to talk about. And I was wondering if you have examples on how we should do that.
Could you just pass to your colleagues for the last session in this round, and then we'll do the second round.
Hello, Aleksander Sławiński from Gazeta Wyborcza newspaper. I have a question to all of you, but especially to General Badia. My question is about the state of the NATO nuclear weapons, because a lot has been said recently about the fact that we don't have to be really scared about the Russian nuclear threats because their warheads are obsolete, because they're technically let's say, outdated, and actually they might be equally dangerous to Russia as to the other countries. But in the same time, the last nuclear test made by the NATO country was in 1996, so quite a long time ago. So my question is, how can we be sure? It was said that, of course, we have supercomputers and so on, but how can we be sure that NATO's nuclear arms are in good state and they will work as they should work if we don't do tests?
Thank you. I'll also go to Alessandro Marone, and then we go back to the panel.
Thank you. Alessandro Marrone, Head of Defense Program, Istituto Affari Internazionali, Rome. Coming from a country which is part of the nuclear sharing, hosts tactical nukes, and is operating F-35, I appreciated the carefully wording of the panelists on this scenario. I tried to craft my question carefully too. What do you think about a scenario where Ukraine retake all occupied territory up to the borders of 23rd February, and both Putin and Russian military establishment, and I differentiate them on purpose, have to choose between negotiating to save something or escalating to nuclear to avoid to lose also Crimea?
Thank you very much. Most of the questions were to the generals, so please go as far as you can. I'm not this is a pretty difficult task, but I'm sure you're up to it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I must make disclaimer one more time. This is an UNCLOS discussion. So, and then please understand that I will not go into details in order to explain what military options are or how we do it or what the state of nuclear weapons would be. But I can assure you that all those questions, of course, are visited almost daily. And with the advice we are giving, and this is the disclaimer number 2, there are military options. And it's a military advice. But it's a political alliance, and it's a political decision at the end of the game. Okay? It's always easier if you are not active military anymore, giving good advice, what you would have done if you would have still been in uniform, but that doesn't count. Okay? So let's be very strict on that one, how we do that. Coming to the first question concerning from President Biden's statement, this is deterrence at his best. This is the way he does it, and this is how you try to deter. And still, what at least my advice I would give in the discussion here is, well, look, what is the Russian doctrine and what is the Russian strategy? When would they use a weapon. And still, it's a territorial question, and this is very sensitive. So at the end of the day, President Biden made a strong statement that he will not tolerate, at the end of the day, it will be a political decision with all the military options on the table. And then it still will be a question, is it a US reaction to that, or will it be a NATO reaction to that? But again, you can be assured, especially when it comes to the nuclear system within NATO in total, we are very much connected to each other, and not only to the US, also to the other states which hold nuclear weapons. And then it will be discussed amongst the nuclear planning group in order on how it would be erected and then presented, and then it will be a political decision. But all I want to say is here, there you see, those are all the mechanics of how you deter in an escalation mechanics, and then we will see how that goes. And will it be at the end a conventional reaction? I mean, if you look at escalation metrics and think it through, I would say most probably this will be one of the first options that will be on the table. But nothing can be ruled out. So this is a question, the way I just can answer it here in this forum right now. When it came to understand what the future holds, and especially when it comes to how do we predict emerging disruptive technologies. Also going into the question, how do you test nowadays? I can assure you there are possibilities and technical means out there. You do not have to detonate a bomb anymore in order to know that it functions or not. Okay? There are so many aspects in technical details how you can reassure that this would work. And yes, of course, it has been said before, there was a time, past 1990, for about 20 years, where everybody thought, well, you know, you could go a bit easier about developing, modernizing, but the last 10 years, look at the world. All the conflicts we do have are long-lasting conflicts. Look at Libya, look at Syria, just for instance. Now is the Ukraine, 2014. So this is where the change came in, and this is, since then, and I explained it to you, how we are increasing, this is where technology is speeding up again, and this is where we invest, the nations invest, and we fully invest in a fully functional nuclear system as well within the means of NATO. Just that everybody is aware of that, what's happening there. So we are fully aware of what has to be done there. This maybe overall, I would like to leave this with that. I will not, as I said, I cannot go into details how the steps are done and how we will react in certain things.
And for the reasons that I think we can all understand. Artur, there was a direct question to you. How do you conduct this very sensitive discussion?
Yes, of course, my point is not that decision makers around NATO and Europe should be running around and screaming that nuclear weapons are great. That wasn't my point, just to make sure of that. But I think that during this crisis, there were occasions in which high-level representatives of NATO states, especially at the beginning of the war, when Putin threatened NATO first with nuclear weapons, to basically come out and say loudly to the public, yes, he's threatening nuclear weapons, but we are in a nuclear alliance. Either we or our allies have nuclear weapons. The risk works both ways. So we're not going to get nuked if we deliver tanks to Ukraine. That's it. And don't make, I think it's a mistake to make statements which undercut your own deterrence. And as I said, US got better at it, but they also made mistakes. At one point at the beginning of the war, for example, the National Security Advisor was publicly warning Russia that if Russia uses chemical weapons, then it will face catastrophic consequences. But in the same briefing, he said that under no circumstance we're going to intervene militarily in this conflict. So this undercuts, because it would lead to World War III. So this kind of rhetoric undercuts your own deterrence. Now, I think the US approach with more ambiguity is much better, and I think it calculates Russian calculations much more. And I could get back to a couple of other questions if the other panelists don't do that later.
Rolf, Sibylle, any aspects you want to pick up on?
Since this panel already indicates for about 5 minutes cognates with 5 exclamation marks, I stop here.
Sibylle, don't feel threatened. I think this is a bluff. The one that says it's the end.
I'll just raise 2 points that for everybody to leave to think about. One is that effective deterrence, we very much focus on the nuclear side, but how to do effective deterrence with advanced conventional weapons, I think, is a really, really important question to solve. And the other one is how to do de-escalation in multi-domain warfare. So I'll leave you with those puzzles to resolve.
And I feel we will continue the discussion further on. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists and to everyone who participated. Thank you very much.